Good morning. I'm Chad Stebbins from the Institute of International Studies, and welcome to yet another Great Britain semester presentation. And in planning the Great Britain semester last spring, the committee decided that we really couldn't have a Great Britain semester without a presentation on Winston Churchill. And so we looked far and wide to find the most distinguished expert that we could, and we discovered that he was right here in Missouri. So I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Jim Williams from Fulton, Missouri, who is making 3 presentations today. We're going to keep him very busy. Next hour, he'll be talking about the London Blitz and the Midwestern connection, and then at 1 o'clock, a presentation on how the National Churchill Museum came to be located in Fulton, Missouri, on the campus of Westminster. Dr. Williams is from Missouri, Kansas City. He was executive director of the National Churchill Museum in Fulton until this last April. He's also taught at Middle Tennessee State University in history for 18 years. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Jim Williams to the stage.
Thank you, Dr. Stebbins, and everyone for having me here at Missouri Southern. This is the first time I've been on your campus, and I'm delighted to be here. And I was not expecting Her Majesty to join us today, but I'm very happy to see her as well, looking fit and fiddle for a 90-year-old. But we're here to talk about one of her prime ministers, actually the first prime minister that she had, Winston Churchill. And I hope to provoke some interest with this title. Is he just another irrelevant dead white male in this era that we are in, looking for models for ourselves across a broader spectrum of humanity than just English guys who were born in 1874, died in 1965, long before most of you were born. I and you and many of you have no personal memories of Winston Churchill, so what I would like to at least try to persuade you of today are some ways that he might be relevant to you. Now, certainly, there are people that think he should be relevant, but that's another matter. You just heard about the National Churchill Museum in Fulton on the campus of Westminster College. If you don't see, especially my afternoon presentation about the history of the place, I wanted to show you a picture of the 17th century Christopher Wren Church that was bombed in 1940 in London and then sat idle for 15 years and then was brought over in the 60s to where it sits today in Fulton. Beneath it is the National Churchill Museum, and there's a statue of Churchill there, and a 32-foot section of the Berlin Wall that Churchill's granddaughter turned into a sculpture after the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989, and it was dedicated in 1992 by President Ronald Reagan. So this is sort of the Churchill complex at Westminster. And not shown in this picture is the gymnasium where he actually delivered his famous so-called Iron Curtain speech in 1946. So I'll talk a lot more about that this afternoon if you can come back at 1. This is not, there we go. So there's Churchill 70 years ago this spring delivering the Iron Curtain speech, which he called the Sinews of Peace. And right there behind him is President Harry Truman, our native son from Missouri. So if you know very little or a lot about Winston Churchill, you can still, or you might want to look at this website that came into being about a year and a half ago for the 50th anniversary of Churchill's death. He died in 1965, so this was created in 2015. It's called churchillcentral.com, and there's a nice timeline I'm just going to show you briefly to refresh our memories. As I said, he was born in 1874, a long, long time ago, the height of the Victorian age, and he was the grandson of a duke. And he was born at Blenheim Palace, so he was definitely an aristocrat from the English aristocracy. And then, as a young man, he attended the Royal Military Academy at Sandhurst, the British equivalent of West Point. And you can see him here in his military uniforms. And in the late 1800s, he participated in conflicts between the British and other people on 4 different continents. He's the only British prime minister to have served in the military on 4 different continents. That's Cuba, India, South Africa, and of course in World War I and II in Europe. So he definitely had firsthand experience in the military. And then he was elected to Parliament in 1900. And except for a few brief gaps, he was a member of Parliament almost until his death in 1965. So this section of Churchill Central's timeline talks about his rising as a politician. His father, Lord Randolph Churchill, was a member of Parliament, and Winston spent the better part of his life trying to live up to his father's reputation. His father died in 1895. And then after the disaster at Gallipoli in World War I in Turkey, Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, meaning he was in charge of the Navy, and he helped conceive and plan this invasion of Turkey with the idea of kind of creating another front in World War I and forcing the Germans to shift attention down to the southeast, and then the Allies could break through on the Western Front. It didn't work out. It was a disaster. We've passed the anniversary last year. You may have heard a lot about Gallipoli or seen movies and documentaries about it. But he was forced out of office. And roughly from the early 20s up until 1940, when he became prime minister, he was in the wilderness. He was out of office. He was not a cabinet member. He was in Parliament, but he did not have a cabinet office. And so these are called the wilderness years. And this is when he became famous for being a voice in the wilderness, especially in the mid to late 30s, as he seemed to be the only voice crying out in Great Britain, warning of the evils of the Nazis in Germany. And then, of course, he became prime minister in 1940 and served until 1945, and then again for several years in the early 50s. One of his more provocative photos there with a Tommy gun, a machine gun. So this is the time of his life that he's best known for, of course, and he achieved heroic status during World War II for rallying the English people. And then they call his later years after the war the elder statesman years, roughly from 1945 to his death in 1965 at the age of 90. And it was very kind of them to put a picture of the Churchill Memorial in Fulton on this website. And then they have a section on the legacy, and this is the springboard to get to what we're talking about today, his relevance. As you can see, this is a scheme of Churchill College at Cambridge. There are other statues and streets and all sorts of things named for Churchill around the world. And of course we have here in Missouri the National Churchill Museum. So it raises the question, does he continue to be relevant? And there have been a lot of discussions about this in the past year or so because of the 50th anniversary of his death last year. And then we're always having anniversaries. The 70th anniversary Iron Curtain speech was this spring. The 100th anniversary of World War I was, is going on now. So there are constant ways that his name comes up as a historical figure. And just even this week, some of these are ripped from this week's headlines, but some of them are, a few months old. There have been people, especially on the right wing of American politics, who have been invoking Winston Churchill as a person we should positively compare Donald Trump to. I'm not going to get into whether that's valid or not. That's not my purpose today. But as you can see, it comes from religious figures like Jerry Falwell Jr., political figures like Newt Gingrich. You can go and Google all these things, and perhaps the most provocative is from Breitbart, which I was not all that familiar with until recently, and apparently they're the website for the alt-right wing of our political spectrum now. And they are one example of people who are invoking Churchill to say that Donald Trump is a lot like him. And I'll just give you a couple examples of, just like Churchill, Donald Trump is warning us against the evils facing the world, and everybody's ignoring him, but he's the voice crying in the wilderness. That's kind of and Trump is warning us about the evils of Islam, just the way Churchill did in the 1890s. And Trump is courageous and doesn't care what other people think, and so that's kind of the gist of it in terms of these comparisons. Of course, there's pushback. Historians get involved. People on the left say it's nonsense. You can go out on the web and explore that to your content. One of the more funny or interesting comebacks to that is, you say that Trump is warning us against the evils like Churchill warned us against Hitler, and then they turn around and say, but Trump is Hitler. So how could he be Churchill? So that's the kind of pointless discussion that this leads to, in my opinion, as a historian. So here are some examples of, people not being very polite in their responses, maybe. But, there's all these, the Catholics going after the Protestants, and, it's really gotten kind of ugly on the web with some of this. Trump is not like Churchill. Yes, he is. No, he isn't. Yes, he is. And coincidentally, perhaps this week, last Sunday, if you watch Masterpiece Theater, you saw the American premiere of Churchill's Secret, a docudrama about his stroke in 1953 when he was prime minister the second time. And that, of course, is the day that Hillary Clinton left the 9/11 commemoration and was woozy and, has led all this week to us hearing a lot about her physical condition and whether we should know that as politicians or not. So yet again, Churchill is on the stage when we're having this discussion because, like happened a lot more in the past than does now, that if you watch that program or are familiar with the story, his family and his circle of closest political assistants managed to keep that stroke a secret for several weeks until he recovered when he's prime minister. Imagine trying to do that today. So that was just an example again of, it seems like every time there's a story, there's somehow that we can link it to Churchill. So leaving all that aside, I'm not going to get into that debate. I'm going to focus instead on how he might seem relevant to you as young people in America today. And of course, I'm talking to the students here, not others in the audience. Churchill Central suggests that there are several themes you can explore in his life, and they have a section on each one of those. I've shown you the chronological sections, but then they also have these thematic sections. And over here, they suggest ways that you can connect his life and career to themes in world history, world culture, and so forth. So the four that I've picked out and put big red arrows next to, you can see, I'm going to start with a little bit about popular culture, and then combine these other three, the man of words, the man of action, and democracy, in the bulk of what I'm talking about today, of how he is still presented to us as somebody who's relevant. In December 1931, excuse me, I'm getting over a sore throat. So. Churchill made a lot of money, and thank goodness for that, because he was spent even more of it throughout his life. But he made a lot of money writing. And so when he was in the wilderness years, one thing he did was write a lot and publish in magazines. And he published this article in Strand magazine in December 1931, and he called it 50 Years Hence. And what that means is what will the world be like basically in 1981? And this essay demonstrates his keen interest in science throughout his life, what we'd call science and technology. That's one reason why Churchill College at Cambridge was created and is devoted to the study of science and technology. And I'm not going to read all of these word by word to you, but I hope you can read his thoughts that the world was speeding up in 1931. He was born in the Victorian age now. We're getting into the truly modern area. It's moving too fast to stop. This will seem very familiar to us. Things are going on in 1931 that a century ago, it was impossible to even think about. And then he goes on to talk about two processes when we try to prophesy. So basically what he's trying to do is foretell the future in this article. And this is one of the things he's known for. He had an expression of the more history the farther back you can look, the farther forward you could see. As a historian, I kind of like that. Although historians aren't good at predicting the future, but he was trying to. He says, one way to do that is to make a comparison between today and what seems most familiar at some time in the past. But what he's going to do is survey the general course of development in our immediate past and endeavor to prolong it into the near future. And the second is the only thing open to us now. By observing all that science have achieved in modern times and the knowledge and power now in her possession, we can predict with some assurance the inventions and discoveries which will govern our future. It's a guess, there's uncertainties, but this essay has been held up through the years as being particularly accurate, or eerily so, you might say. Of course, it seems like every decade things move faster and faster than the one before, and it's no surprise that these past 50 years have moved so quickly, and the next 50 will be even faster. Did you know that somebody like him was talking about nuclear energy in December 1931? Almost 15 years before the atomic bombs were used in Japan, and nuclear energy became something of a household expression finally. So this is what he says about what scientists are doing. There's no question among scientists that this gigantic source of energy exists. What is lacking is the match to set the bonfire alight. Well, of course, we figured that out toward the end of World War II. And then, if nothing has gotten your attention so far, this one might: wireless telephones and television. He's already thinking about, in December 1931, wireless telephones and television. This is the time, people were still sending telegrams. Telephones were, crank and talk to the operator like you see in the old movies and TV shows. He says it's natural that they will be wireless. And, they will enable their owner to connect up with any room similarly installed and hear and take part in the conversation as well as if he put his head in through the window. So he's predicting some sort of cell phone or mobile phone and television being looking at your screen and what's that called? Chat, Skype, whatever version of wireless television. It would rarely be necessary to call in person on any but the most intimate friends. And here we are, communicating by text and Facebook and everything, and sometimes rarely even seeing people face to face. Then he talks about new strains of microbes. We shall escape the absurdity of growing a whole chicken in order just to eat the breast or the wing. Why not just grow the parts that we want to eat and leave the rest of the chicken out of it? And now I'm hearing about scientists growing organs in labs and things like that, where you don't have to transplant from a live animal. So the point is just seeing where his mind was in 1931 and how interesting it is to read things like this of his. So he's writing for a general audience. He says, I've touched on this sphere only lightly. In a future which our children may live to see, powers will be in the hands of men altogether different from any by which human nature has been molded. Explosive forces, energy, materials, machinery will be available upon a scale which can annihilate whole nations. That's really what he's warning against. He goes through kind of the fun part of science, but in typical Churchill fashion, he ends up with a warning about despotism, tyranny, the dangers to democracy, of, in this case, science and technology. It is therefore above all things important that the moral philosophy and spiritual conceptions of men and nations should hold their own amid these formidable scientific evolutions. He even says it would be much better to call a halt in material progress and discovery rather than to be mastered by our own apparatus and the forces which it directs. There are secrets too mysterious for man in his present state to know. And that kind of foreshadows the whole debate. One example, of course, about the use of atomic weapons and the many examples of that kind of philosophical, ethical debate since then about technologies. Should we even explore cloning or DNA or any number of examples? It's just too dangerous for humans to go there. We shouldn't even go there. So that's what he's discussing in 1931, coming out of World War I, looking at what's going on the continent and wondering if some of this scientific progress that falls into the hands of despots and tyrants will be a good thing. And this is his conclusion. Forces terrific and devastating will be in their hands. Their lives will be barren if they have not a vision above material things. And with the hopes and powers will come dangers out of all proportion to the growth of man's intellect. He's saying basically that science is farther ahead than most of us in 1931 are able to marshal, to control. Once more, the choice is offered between blessing and cursing. Never was the answer that will be given harder to foretell. So, of course, looking back at his 50 years hence, it looks like, yet again, he's a great prophet. He knew enough about the past and the present to see ahead into the future and anticipate these many debates and problems. So that's the first way. If you like that sort of intellectual stimulation of reading what people said in the past and kind of, how could he know that? How could he be so aware of what's going on that he could see the danger? He could see around corners and, way into the future. Well, that's really interesting for a lot of people. But for most people, Winston Churchill is somebody that inspires them as a man of words, a man of action, and as the great defender of democracy in the 20th century. So that's what I want to focus on. for the rest of the time. In the program, it mentions Churchill won the Nobel Prize for Literature. That was mostly for his history of the Second World War, but he wrote lots and lots of other books and millions of words. He wrote, I think it's Dickens and Sir Walter Scott. He wrote more than those two British authors combined, number of words. So he was a man of words and a spoken word as well. His speech here in Missouri that made him forever connected to our state. And he was a man of action, of course, and a great defender. So I thought I would illustrate what people see in him sort of narrowly with Martin Gilbert's 12 aspects of his wartime leadership. But we're not always at war. We don't always need that kind of leadership necessarily. So I want to broaden it out with his granddaughter, Celia Sands, and her 14 qualities of what she calls his inspiring leadership. So here we go. Now this is Sir Martin Gilbert. Unfortunately, he died last February. Prolific author, not just about Churchill, but about the Holocaust, First and Second World Wars, Jewish history, all kinds of other topics. But he was the official biographer of Winston Churchill. And there he is with the bust of Churchill that's now in the Capitol of the United States in Washington. Another kind of Churchill being pulled in the debates. When I was the director of the museum, inevitably in an event like this, somebody would come up to me and say, "Isn't it terrible that Obama took the bust of Churchill out of the Oval Office?" And I wasn't going to take the bait and get into that because we don't do that as museum directors. But there again, there is a certain element in the American public since 2009, when the White House did return a bust of Churchill to the British Embassy. It had been on loan in the Bush administration. They returned it, much like this one. And I might say, well, there still is a bust of Churchill in the Oval Office or in the White House. It's just up in the family quarters, and that doesn't satisfy anybody. So there's yet another one of those kind of using Churchill to beat each other up in American politics. So luckily Martin Gilbert was English and didn't have to endure at least the American version of using Churchill that way. So here are his 12 aspects of Churchill's war leadership, and they're pretty self-explanatory. There is never any doubt that Churchill believed in himself. He did not have self-esteem issues at all. Even probably the most self-doubt he ever had was in 1915 after Gallipoli, when he was forced out of office, as I mentioned before. What became the remedy of that is interesting, because that's the year that he started to paint. So as therapy, his sister-in-law suggested that he take up painting. And in his lifetime, he painted more than 500 paintings, which are quite good. We have several in Fulton at the National Church Museum. And last winter in St. Louis, there was a major exhibition of nearly 50 of his paintings. And that's how he, throughout his life, that was his therapy for if he needed spiritual uplift or psychological uplift. He also believed in his own destiny. His great-grandson, Jonathan Sands, who lives in Houston, has a book out you may have seen called God and Churchill. Jonathan would be happy to come talk to you. He likes to talk and sell his book, and he's very enthusiastic about the idea that we can find positive evidence that God put Winston Churchill in particular situations, protected him from harm, and put him there to live out this destiny of being a soldier in harm's way, escaping from prison in South Africa in the Boer War, the bullets, one of those situations, kind of like George Washington. The bullets are flying every which way. People are falling all around him and all through these battles and the revolution and so on. They never hit him. It's almost like Winston Churchill has that bubble around him. And in World War II, he'd climb up on the roof of the Admiralty building and watch the air raids. And his bodyguards and family were terrified, and he just had this confidence, nothing's going to hurt me. It seems foolhardy at times, but for people around him, it can be inspiring. He certainly was a hard worker, and he had a lot of people working hard for him to get his work done. He certainly inspired hope. His speeches, his going out amongst the ruins and talking to people and, pulling them up, hope was important. Creating and maintaining national unity, he certainly did that. As the prime minister of a coalition government, in a sense he had to do that, but he said he didn't like to take credit for things. And one of the points he made about unity was that the British people gave him the honor of providing the roar to the British lion. They were the lion. He merely provided the roar, he said. No surrender, encouragement, all of those wartime speeches, personal appearances. He was what we would call a micromanager. I'm not a big fan of micromanagers. I don't know about you, but he would dictate what they called minutes, memos. And if you read about Churchill, some of it is just exasperatingly silly, like why are we using this name for a city when it should be this, Istanbul and Constantinople kind of things. But he had the brain to suck up those details and then use them to create practical plans. He was involved. He was also the Minister of Defense as well as Prime Minister, so part of it was his job to do that. He wanted to see things for himself. He got out and looked and got information from other people. He didn't rely on his subordinates, the generals and so on, to keep him informed. He certainly had the ability to make hard decisions. He had personal courage, which I'll talk about some more in a minute, and compassion and passion. So those are Martin Gilbert's 12 principles. I will end with Celia Sands, his granddaughter, who's written several books and about her grandfather. That's her there. And these points are drawn from her book about his leadership, inspiring leadership, We Shall Not Fail. So I'm going to give you a little bit more detail about this, then I'll finish. The first one is be courageous. Churchill said, "Courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities because it is the quality which guarantees all others." So Celia boils that down to meet challenges head on, be curious and daring, seek opportunities to display courage in everyday life. This book, by the way, is kind of meant for business people, you and I out there being leaders in our church, our business, our life. So it's not just focused on his life, it's using these things to draw principles out for our everyday life. A good leader creates a culture where failure and error are looked upon as steps towards success. A demonstration of personal courage can galvanize a team or organization that lacks resolve. And have faith. The most inspiring opportunities for courage come when you've faced the longest odds. The second one is to challenge convention. Churchill said, "No idea is so outlandish that it should not be considered with a searching, but at the same time, a steady eye." He was certainly the victim of, he was great at challenging convention, but also the victim of people saying, these tanks can't work. He's credited with sort of helping to invent tanks in World War I. various other technological military innovations in World War II. So he challenged convention. Celia says, when new problems arise, consider creating new organizations or methods for solving them. Refurbish rusty organizations. Infuse ordinary tasks with purpose by humanizing them, adding an element of fun, and removing bureaucracy. Be pragmatic and flexible. Learn from your mistakes. Make sure technology is not spurned by those who don't understand it. And again, Churchill was certainly the victim of that sort of thinking in his life. On speaking and writing, he said, of all the talents bestowed upon men, none is so precious as the gift of oratory. And with be magnanimous, his famous quotation, I was once asked to devise an inscription for a monument in France. I wrote, in war, resolution; in defeat, defiance; in victory, magnanimity; in peace, goodwill. Magnanimity breeds trust and loyalty among subordinates and partners. Be magnanimous toward those who lack your ability or good fortune, and you will find that former opponents become friends and allies. Resist bullies. Hitler certainly was a bully, and other examples in his lifetime. Stand up to people. Keep your enemies close. Co-op support when opposition to your leadership stirs. Keep bullies off balance with your humor and sense of dignity. Touch the troops. By that she means tour the entire organization. Don't rely on reports from subordinates. Get out there in the factory floor, the retail play, whatever your business is. Build morale by having fun and spreading optimism in your visits. Churchill certainly had a childlike sense of humor and sense of fun that was infectious, even during the war. Turn details into action. Keep thinking up new ways to gather and display key info about progress within an organization. I'm summarizing these very quickly. If you are interested, you can find the book and read more details. Of course, never surrender. This famous quotation, never, 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 never give in. And the part that is usually chopped off is the part about, unless fundamental principles kind of force you to change your mind. Experiment. Encourage a culture where what counts is thinking, trying, and testing. Great words to live by here at a university. Build hope and confidence. Make the creation and maintenance of good morale a daily aim. Share the risks and hardships with people in your organization. Forge alliances. Tough allies respect toughness. Strong leaders never appear desperate when seeking an alliance. And then find your Clementine, his wife Clementine Churchill. Celia says, true partners tell you when you are out of line or when you need to take a break. Able partners develop their own character and independence without diminishing your role. Clementine was famous for writing Churchill a letter that's reproduced in this book. He's about 6 weeks into being prime minister. This is at the end of June in 1940. She says, my darling, I hope you will forgive me if I tell you something that I feel you ought to know. One of the men in your entourage, a devoted friend, has been to me and told me that there is a danger of your being generally disliked by your colleagues and subordinates. And she goes on to say, my darling Winston, I must confess I have noticed a deterioration in your manner, and you are not so kind as you used to be. She knew he was under tremendous pressure, but advised him to not give in to irascibility and rudeness. And then she says, please forgive your loving, devoted, and watchful Clemmy. P.S. I wrote this at Checkers last Sunday, tore it up, but here it is now. So he had a partner who was willing to step in and tell him he needed to shape up. Follow your canvas. Expect the unexpected. Leave time for rest and relaxation. And Celia says, wise leaders have a hobby or pursuit outside of work that brings them joy. For Churchill, that was painting. And then the obvious, winning the war. How do you do that? And I will leave it there for now. I think I'm to leave time for questions, so I will sum up by saying I hope that by hearing Churchill's own words and a little bit about from his official biographer and granddaughter as to why he can be an example of inspiring leadership for us in our times. I hope I've at least made you think about ways that as you're studying Sam Walton and Bill Gates and those corporate kind of folks for leadership and other historical figures, you might think of Winston Churchill as well. It's not perfect, I should say, if I'm anticipating questions. You would not have wanted to work for him. He would have had many complaints to HR these days about the horrible things that he inflicted on him. He made secretaries one after the other cry, and they were up at 3 a.m, and he was naked around people that he shouldn't have been naked around. All those things. I'm not neglecting those things. I'm not holding those up as part of the good example. But people forgave him a lot because of the situation and his many, many positive qualities. Yes, sir. Yes, he went to France several times while the Nazis were invading in 1940. He wanted to go on the ships with D-Day, and the king finally said, no, you're not going to do that. Or if you're going to go, I'm going to go. And then Churchill said, well, you can't have that. So he did put himself in harm's way. That's what I was talking about earlier. That would have been when the British crossed the Rhine, probably a few days after they actually did. I don't know the exact date, but he did go to D-Day 3 or 4 days after, the beachhead was, he went to Normandy. So that was typical of him. He wanted to see the battlefield. He was an old soldier. He wanted to see for himself. So I'm not surprised that your father saw him. Other questions? Yes, sir. Yeah, great grandson. What do I think Churchill would have said about a book on God and Churchill? Well, Churchill didn't talk much about God, and just like a lot of our political figures, Roosevelt, Truman, a lot of people at the time. But one of the points that Jonathan makes is he does talk about, in a vague sort of way, and he could recite the Bible right and left. He learned that as a child and came from a time where that was part of the literature that people used. So he could use the Bible to his purposes as an orator, speechwriter, and all those things. I'm not sure what Churchill would have said. His daughter, Mary Soames, was famous for, with people ask, well, what would your father do? She would say, I have no idea. Don't ask me those kind of questions. So I'm not dodging the question, but I'm a bit skeptical about, as a historian, it's hard to prove that God is working, that, God's protecting certain people, or some of the claims that Jonathan makes in his book. He's persuaded of it. He's the great-grandson. He can do whatever he wants. He's not a historian. But I'm a bit skeptical, and I wonder if Churchill never... He did let on that he thought that it was his destiny. So I think he would have given some stock to the idea that God or some force was was there with him, but he was not an overtly religious person going to church and doing all of that stuff. So it's a the book is more persuasive or more interesting than you might think. I will say that, because most of us go into it thinking, well, he wasn't religious at all. But like I said, a lot of people from the time that I think of, Roosevelt, Truman, they're not outwardly religious, going to church all the time, but there was something there in their core that they were drawing on, some kind of spiritual strength. So I think definitely he had that. But he was a peacemaker, and I think he definitely would have objected to the misuse of his words about Islam, from 125 years ago. In Sudan, a kind of very different situation in a lot of ways, but if you look at the broader picture, he was trying to create what we would call an inclusive, world peace depends on inclusivity, not fighting over religion and many other things that he thought were pretty irrational. Other questions? The people with class coming up have left, so. Thank you.